Welcome to Friday Night Out Quick Hits. Tonight we'd like to talk with you a little bit about 9 important skills for communication. Now, I hope you enjoyed the activity you participated in tonight. I'm sure you had a really good experience. One of the interesting things about all the activities and everything that we participate in is that in one way or another, communication is involved. And so I think it'll be interesting tonight to take just a few minutes to talk a little bit about communication and how it was that you communicated with each other, with the other people that were there, with the people that you came with, and also maybe with the facilitator, the extension agent tonight. Now, you should see, you should have one of these. If you don't, that's okay. But giving you a little, we call them pocket notes. They give you some information that we're going to share in the next 10 or 15 minutes with regard to communication. So if you have a chance, go ahead and pull that out. And we're going to talk a little bit about 9 skills that we know from the last 30 years of research can really help us in whatever activities we participate in. So we're going to talk for just a few minutes, about the next 10, 12 minutes, about the 4 don'ts of communication: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. We're also going to talk about 5 do's: calm down, speak non-defensively, use specific complaints, and validate other people, and then overlearn these 9 skills so that when we need them, especially when we have a conflict and it's really easy, and when we do specific activities to have a difference of opinion, that we can negotiate those differences of opinion in constructive ways. So I want to talk for just a second about some general communication patterns, and then we'll come back to the 9 skills. This is really an interesting scenario or cycle that many of us go through, and that is that one person, for example, as you're participating in the activity tonight, maybe, becomes critical, and the other person becomes defensive, and then because the other person might get upset or frustrated because they're feeling criticized, if they get angry and upset, person 1 can focus on their anger instead of the fact that person 1 started the whole problem, and then person 1 can play the victim. Why are you getting so upset? Chill out. It's not that big of a deal, right? We play the cycle of victimization over and over again. Or we can look at it like this, and this sometimes happens. Who knows? Maybe this happened tonight during your activity, or maybe it's happened at other times in your life. So person 1 criticizes person 2 becomes defensive, and because person 2 is felt criticized and attacked, then they blame person 1 for causing all the problems, and then person 2 can play the victim. Now, the interesting thing about playing the victim is that anytime person 1 or person 2 or anybody is playing the victim, we can't heal our relationships. Why? Because our victimhood depends on somebody else wronging us, and very often in conflicts, it really does take 2 to tango. In other words, 2 people cause the problem, and even if only one really instigates the problem, it takes another person to be able to diffuse it and not go through a cycle that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes that so many relationships go through. Now, you can see this in parenting. You can see these victimization patterns in the workplace, can't you? You might even have seen them tonight during your activity. You can see it in all kinds of relationships. So I want you to think about the principles that we can learn from not playing this victimization role or slipping into this victimization pattern. I want to be careful here and clarify that there are real victims of abuse. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the victimization pattern that many of us tend to slip into. So how do we short-circuit the victimization pattern? Well, one of the things we do is we try and do the right thing for the right reason in our relationships. Now, I want you to think about, as you look at this slide, the last week or 2, or maybe even during the activity tonight, saying or doing something that went against your value and belief system. And we're going to label those things maybe that we've done in the last week or 2, the destructive world. In other words, think of a time when you had an opportunity to do the right thing for the right reason in behalf of someone else or even for yourself, and you didn't do it. Now, I want you to think about the emotions that you experienced, and very often those emotions will be guilt, anger, frustration, and on and on and on, but they tend to be what we call negative emotions. Now, I want you to think about tonight or in the last week or 2, a time when you did something right. You did the right thing for the right reason in behalf of somebody else or for yourself. And what emotions do we typically feel when we live according to our value and belief system, when we do the right thing for the right reason? Well, what we typically feel are feelings of peace and joy and happiness and love. And so one of the interesting things about this principle is that we can really short-circuit the pattern of victimization by trying to do the right thing for the right reason. So what was it tonight that you tried to do for the right reason in this situation? Now, one of the other things we really want to talk about tonight is some rules for constructive conflict. In other words, how do we short-circuit conflict? Because it's really, really easy in any situation where we interact, like this activity tonight, to get a little frustrated sometimes because we may have a different perspective than somebody else about how this activity is supposed to unfold. So let's talk about them for just a second. Rule 1, refuse to use destructive conflict tactics. We're going to talk more about those destructive conflict tactics in a minute, but we want to try and get rid of criticism. We want to try and get rid of contempt, defensiveness, and what we call stonewalling. Rule 2, choose to gain the skills to conflict constructively. That would have to do with calming down, speaking non-defensively, using I messages or complaining effectively, validating, and also, as we talked about, overlearning the skills so we can use them when we need them. Rule 3, focus on feelings first, then move to the specific issue. That's really, really important. This has everything to do with learning how to complain. Complaining is actually one of the healthiest things you and I can do if we do it right. And so how do we complain? We focus on feelings first. This is how I feel when this happened tonight because, or when this happened in this situation because. This is how I feel when this happened because, and you explain it. Focus on feelings first, then move to the specific issue. Rule 4, focus on one issue at a time. How many times have you been discussing something and somebody brings up a complaint and then somebody else brings up another complaint, another one, and then pretty soon we get into this big mud fight. There's no way that we can negotiate that. So when one complaint is being discussed, then we need to keep it at one complaint. And if somebody advances another one, we need to call time out and say, hang on, it's important what you have to say, and I want to make sure that we can discuss that, but let's see if we can't resolve this one first, and then we'll talk about that. Rule 5, identify the patterns of behavior that reveal the root cause of the issue. So often it's not about crumbs left on the counter, or dishes left in the sink, or clothing left out, or whatever it is, or being 10 minutes late. It's about deeper issues like commitment and loyalty and love and trust and the things that are deeper in our relationships that we tend to fight about in symptomatic ways. For example, if we're late and we don't call, we're later than a half an hour some night and we don't call, that could become a trust issue. And so we might fight about, hey, I was only a half an hour late, sorry I didn't call, but anything, those kinds of things that we do when we become defensive. But the deeper issue might be, honey, I was concerned about you when you didn't call, and I feel like that I can't trust you to think about my needs and my concerns when you're going to be late. Rule 6, think win-win. If one person wins in a relationship and one person loses, then the relationship loses. If one person wins in an argument and one loses, then the relationship loses. So we have to really think about win-win. How can we help meet both needs in our relationships? And then learn to calm yourself. What do you do to calm yourself? We know that you need to calm down at least 25 minutes to get below what we call a flood zone. A zone emotionally where we get out of control and we say things that we don't mean and that hurt our relationships. So what do? Take a nap, take a walk, listen to music, breathe deeply, and then what do you do to calm your partner? I know I'm very ticklish, so all my wife has to do is tickle me a little bit or even act like she's going to, and that works. Or to say things like, this isn't that big of a deal when it has to do with our children, but, and then she'll talk about the child. That's my cue to, it's okay, right? Rule 9, to be congruent in your communication. That is, to say what you mean and mean what you say. Therapists make a lot of money trying to help couples learn how to actually be truthful to each other. And it's important that we learn that now, to say what you mean and mean what you say. Yes, be careful of their feelings, but to say what you mean and don't stuff it. Rule 10, to seek closure and to resolve the specific issue as soon as possible. That's important because negativity is the major predator in our relationships. If you came out of this activity tonight feeling frustrated with your partner, you're feeling negative. If you feel resentful, you're feeling negative. Negativity is the major predator, and we want to stop that as soon as possible by resolving the conflict. So here's how the cycle of positivity looks. You can see that the 5 do's are in red, and And that includes overlearning the skills in the middle and staying calm. But let's talk about them for just a minute. So one of the things that can happen if we're frustrated or we're feeling frustrated about something is we can bring up a complaint. An iMessage, as we talked about. This is how I feel when this happens, because the other person's responsibility then is to accept responsibility for that complaint, not to get defensive, not to say things like, well, I know I said I'd be home on time, but, traffic was heavy, and, or I know I said I'd call, or I know I said I'd do this, but to say, you know what, I blew it. Criticism is just on the other side of the continuum with complaint. Criticism is when we attack another person's personality with accusation and blame. We're not talking about a behavior like we do in complaining, but we attack their personality. You're selfish, you're lazy, you're not competent, you're not lovable. All those messages that we can send. Constructive criticism is really an oxymoron. We never, ever should criticize. It's okay, though, and it's very healthy to bring up complaints. So when we bring up a complaint, someone brings up a complaint against us, we need to not be defensive. We need to accept responsibility for it and say, you know what, I understand how that made you feel, or I'd like to change that in the future, or I'm sorry, honey, I didn't realize that you'd be worried about me, and in the future, if I'm going to be later than 10 minutes, I'll promise to call. If we don't short-circuit the cycle here in the complaint and with accepting responsibility, then it's easy to move to the next level, which is contempt, where we start doing things like this: rolling the eyes, name-calling, sarcasm, threats, victimization, all those kinds of things that don't help in our communication at all. Now, one of the things that can short-circuit that is to speak non-defensively. When we talk about things, to lower our voice and not to say things like you, and those kinds of things. Stonewalling actually happens when people go through this cycle repeatedly and they can't figure out how to get rid of or manage conflict successfully. Where the constructive conflict logo is on your screen is really what we would replace with mud fights, where people just go through this cycle of criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and then they get to that mud fight over and over, and it withers away their relationship. Remember, negativity is the major predator of our relationships, and once that happens over and over, at some point, and this is the way we know relationships are fragile, people begin to stonewall. They get in and out of battles with each other, but then they just check out. And about 80% of stonewallers are men. And so how do we short-circuit that or get rid of that? We validate, we appreciate, we listen with our eyes, and we listen with our ears, we listen with our minds, we listen with our hearts to the needs being expressed, and we use bridge words like, then what happened, and what are you going to do about it, or how can I help, and those words that connect the statements that other people are using so that we let them know we're listening. To validate is really the key to all communication, to let people know that they're important. And that's really the message that we want to send, that they're lovable, and the second message we want to send is that they're capable, they can do anything. In all negative communication, criticism, defensiveness, and contempt, what we're expressing, and even stonewalling, is you're not lovable and you're not capable. And so if we can validate and we can appreciate, then we can actually resolve conflicts without getting to the mud fight. And the interesting thing is we have a honeymoon period after a mud fight or after constructive conflict. But the amazing thing about the honeymoon period after constructive conflict, when we don't get to the mud fight, is it's much deeper and it's much richer. Then we tend to have relative peace, and then we go through this cycle again. Those of you who are skilled, those of us who are skilled and have worked on these things, learn how to stay calm, learn how to complain using iMessages, learn how, when somebody complains against us, not to get defensive but to accept responsibility. We learn how to speak non-defensively and not escalate the cycle through contempt by pushing buttons. We learn how to validate and appreciate. These are some keys to communication. I hope you're able to use these tonight in this activity. Wonderful, wonderful activities being provided for you, and I hope you appreciate the extension agent or the facilitator who was able to put this on. Now, what we've given you in this little packet is a way to actually track how well you do with the 5 do's and the 4 don'ts, and how well you're doing with those 10 rules for constructive conflict. Why would I give this to you? Because I know that years ago, as I was reading through a manual on constructive conflict, that I was struck with the fact that I was breaking about half of them. And so what I did was I made a copy of that and put it in my pocket and carried it around with me for about 2 months, and read it every day, and really, really worked on getting rid of the things that would hurt my relationship and doing more of the things that would help it. This is really just for you to put on your mirror, to put on your refrigerator, to put in your pocket, so that you can remind yourself of the kinds of things that will help in your communication, regardless of what activity or what event you're involved with. So for those of you who are conducting this activity tonight, I would recommend that if you get a chance now that you offer this evaluation to those who are there. Thank you.